Can you describe an early experience you had in a public library?
Oh, I have lots, and they're all at the Flower Mound Public Library, where I would beg my parents to take me after school and on weekends. And I remember once I was horrified because we had just come from the pool and I had a book I had to return, and it was a manga book that I already wasn't supposed to have checked out, and it was at the back of our gym bag, so it got a little bit damp, and then I put it through returns hoping nobody would notice, and then I got that ding on my library account. So when I tried to check out books, the librarian was like, "I'm sorry, but you have to pay for damages," and I freaked out. I thought I was going to be banned from libraries forever, but it was okay. We paid the $15, replaced the book. But yeah, that just goes to show, like, I love the library so much. I was horrified that I might be locked out forever.
What are you currently reading?
I am on a streak with the author Daniel Mason because I really enjoyed his book Northwoods, which is kind of a gothic, surrealist, magical realism novel set in Western Massachusetts. So I thought, yeah, I really like this guy's style. So I'm reading The Winter Soldier, which is an earlier novel of his.
What is your research process for writing a new book?
Pretty much the same as my research process for an academic paper or a dissertation. I just read, and I try to read as broadly as I can. I'll pick with like an introductory text and then chase down footnotes and see all the research that's been published on the subject, where the controversies are, where the new research is, what the main lines of discussion are. And importantly, for writing fiction, I try to read fiction written by authors who either lived in that time period or are doing pastiches of that period, because I think, for instance, we can learn just as much about the Victorians in the 1840s from a novel written in the 1840s as we can from a contemporary history book describing that period, if not more, because I think it's important to see how people were talking about themselves and telling narratives about who they were and what the social codes were. So yeah, just a ton of reading and keeping track of a little annotated bibliography.
What's your favorite fantasy trope?
I think a trope I really like is when the villain from the first act becomes an ally in the third act. That always gets me.
Tell us about where you sit when you write.
I sit in lots of places. I am not precious about where I write. Sometimes I write on a plane, sometimes it's a train, sometimes it's a cafe. Ideally, it's at home in my office that's in front of a window. I don't like enclosed spaces, so my office is just the living room, and it's very simple. I'm not like authors who have whole office setups or rituals or even plants, because I think at some point it just all becomes a distraction, and every little thing that you add to your setup becomes a barrier to writing if you don't have it. So I've just trained myself to write wherever I can in whatever time I have.
Language plays a big part of Babel, especially where their meaning is lost in translation. Can you give us one of your favorite lost in translation or lacunas?
I was just talking about this with a class on translation the other day. We were talking about how very basic conceptual metaphors for things like space and time are not necessarily the same things across languages. So you might think we're English speakers, and it's very natural for us to associate the future with a forward-oriented direction. The future is ahead, the past is behind. So it's like, you know, plan ahead or look back, etc. And you would think, oh, you can't really untangle these concepts, but actually this isn't necessarily true in other languages. In Chinese, for instance, the future is associated with what's ahead of you, and the past is associated with ahead, and the future is associated with what's behind. And the reasoning I've heard for this is, well, you can see the past, but you don't know what's in the future. You can only walk backwards towards the future. So I think that's really cool. Even directionality and time and space changes between languages. So think of all the other infinite images or illusions or shades of meaning that get lost in translation.
Do you think reading literature with characters that are different than the reader build empathy, and maybe through that empathy create a stronger community?
I think so. Well, I just read this paper called The Sovereignty of the Good by a philosopher named Iris Murdoch, and her argument is essentially that being able to see what's good and cultivating virtue and doing what's right involves an unselfing. And by this she means essentially the ability to step outside of yourself and see the world as it actually is, to let go of your subjective biases and prejudices and preferences. She thinks humans are essentially selfish animals. We're thinking about what benefits us, who's close to us, like what pleasures do we want to experience, but being able to step outside of that self, this little body that is just trying to grab and hoard resources for the one, and asking, well, what else is out there? What's in the world when I'm not present? What is part of objective material reality? And her argument is that that moves us closer towards what is true and what is good and what is virtuous, which is very abstract, philosophical line of argument, but I think that's true in fiction. I think being able to forget my individual perception of things and looking at the world through somebody else's eyes does broaden my moral landscape, makes me care about people and things that I never would have thought to care about, and I think that's essential in building a community.
What's your favorite variety of apple?
So I'm from Boston, and our favorite thing to do in the autumn is go apple picking at the orchard. So I've tasted many varieties, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking of a time we tried an apple that was very mild but had this delicate like floral taste, and we were all joking, oh, it has like this floral afterbirth instead of aftertaste. And I forgot the name of that apple, but I really liked that one. But if I'm just at a grocery store and I don't have the niche varieties, I go for the Fuji apple. I like them sweet and crispy.
You're well-traveled. What are the elements of a truly great city?
History. I think a city that doesn't feel like there are just layers and layers of time and culture and experiences is a boring city to me. So I've felt this vertigo in Rome and in Pompeii more than anywhere else, the sense that, oh, if I could only reach through this veil of time, I could touch and speak to the people who were just here eating pizza or whatever out of these taverns, or walking through these courtyards where the mosaic tiles are so perfectly preserved, the color is still so vibrant. And I get this, confusion about time when I'm in a place like that. It feels like it's hard to conceive of time as creating distance in the same way that space creates distance. And I get really frustrated that I can't just travel back centuries, but apparently to do so would require nearly infinite energy. So,
what's the best wedding song?
I don't know about the best, but the song that we did our first dance to was Dusty Springfield's I Only Want to Be With You, so that's the best in my heart.
Who's a non-literary artist that you find inspiration from?
I like film a lot, so I could just start rattling off directors who I really love. I'm on a Park Chan-wook streak right now. We saw Old Boy a little while back, and we've now finished out the Vengeance trilogy, and I think his kind of dark and twisted visions are very compelling, and all of his films have made me obsessive over what they were trying to say and how they're historically embedded. I just think he's like a really visionary director.
What's a nostalgic food item from your childhood?
Lychee jelly fruit cups.
What is nonsense literature?
So I have been reading and teaching Lewis Carroll, which I think is my paragon example. It's a literature where nothing really makes sense. There are no stable rules. There's not a stable world, and that stability doesn't matter. And I think it's like the polar opposite of a lot of epic fantasy novels that rely on a magic system and a stable set of expository principles, like, oh, this is the kingdom, this is the history of the kingdom, here are the creatures that are in the kingdom, etc. Nonsense literature isn't interested in any of that. You might be talking to a flamingo in one scene, and the next you could be at a tea party. And I'm fascinated in how authors like Lewis Carroll keep the reader engaged and present even when the world is kind of shifting under their feet. I think that takes a lot of skill.
If you weren't a writer or an academic, what do you think you'd be doing?
Maybe working in fashion or food, or more realistically, being a lawyer, because the safe thing to do would have been to go to law school.
All right, so we'll switch to this or that. So I'm going to give you, I think most of these are two options, but one I think has, yeah, they're all two options. So early morning or late at night?
Definitely early morning.
Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi?
I know that Empire is technically the better film, and I agree, but Return is just ridiculous fun. My friends and I actually have a yearly tradition when we do our big reunion where we only watch the last act in a trilogy or a series, and we always start at midnight. So we've started Return of the King at midnight. We recently did Spider-Man 3 and the Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn Part 1 and 2 after midnight, and then everybody was very mad when I woke them up the next morning. But yeah, I love the final act of a series when everything is tied up, all the plot lines, all the romantic arcs. There's just such satisfaction. And the second act, which is often the most technically accomplished act, like the Two Towers and Empire, they're fantastic, but they always end on cliffhangers, so you have to go straight into 3.
Outside or inside?
Inside.
Elves or orcs?
Elves.
Barred owl or snowy owl?
That's a tricky one. I really love birds, and I was also raised on this children's series called The Guardians of Ga'Hoole, which is kind of a crazy fantasy series about owls that live on an island and have to defend the island against mean owls. And in that series, there's this order of like barn owl supremacists who think that they are the most beautiful, elegant owl. So I've always had an attachment to barn owls because the main character in that series is Soren, a barn owl, but they're also the evil ones that think they're better than all the other owls. So I don't know.
Strawberry jam or clotted cream?
Clotted cream.
England or Scotland?
Ooh, refuse to answer.
Scotch or bourbon?
Scotch. I am a whiskey person, but I have done all my whiskey tastings in Scotland and never in the American South.
That's it.
That was fun.
Good.